we have two friends that have been with us for a long time. Francis Adeney and Terry Muck are well known among us. Francis is the Emerita Professor of Evangelism and Global Mission at Louisville Seminary and author of Graceful Evangelism, Christian Witness in a Complex World, Christianity Encountering World Religions, which she and Terry wrote together. Her husband, Terry Muck, is a retired executive director of the Louisville Institute and also a retired professor at Austin Seminary and Asbury Seminary. They are going to share with us, Francis, from her experience in Indonesia, where she served on mission assignment as a professor a few years ago, and this was written up in her Christian Women in Indonesia, a Narrative Study of Gender and Religion. And Terry speaks from the position of being the co-founder and president of the Society for Buddhist Christian Studies. They're going to share with us their stories of friendship, interfaith friendship, and what they have gleaned from that. They have both been friends of mine over many years. I am grateful to them for their hospitality extended to me at their beautiful summer cabin. And they have been both gentle friends and gentle mentors. So please welcome first Terry Muck, and then he will be followed by his wife, Frances Adeney.
As nearly as I can remember, I have only once tried to scalp an admissions ticket to a sporting event. We were to attend a sold-out baseball game, and at the last minute, Francis, not feeling well, decided not to attend. And on the way to the ballpark, I decided to sell the extra ticket outside the front gate. I arrived, and I set up shop. The first person to approach me offered me half the face value of the ticket. With visions of hard-to-get scalp tickets going for 3 or 4 times their face value running through my mind, I was offended. I was indignant. I scoffed at his offer. I turned my back on him and looked for other potential buyers. Time passed. Game time approached. My original potential buyer was still hanging around, and when he saw my lack of customers, he approached me again. He repeated his half-price offer. Stubbornly, I was even more dismissive of him. I snorted. I pshawed. I refused his offer again, and I was really quite rude. Game time came and went. Still not a single other offer. And yes, my original and only potential buyer came and this time offered me about a 10% increase over his original half-price offer, a pittance. And I, swallowing my pride, accepted. I was embarrassed, and I just wanted to wash my hands of the whole interaction. I wanted to get away from him totally and forget my boorish behavior. And then, as I walked through the front gate towards the aisle where my seat was located, I realized, I think for the first time, that I would be spending the next 4 hours sitting right next to him. I tell you this story to introduce a proposition I would like you to consider with me this evening. And the proposition is this: we should shape the way we relate to persons of other religious traditions, acknowledging the possibility that we may be sitting next to him or her in heaven for all eternity. I propose we begin our consideration of this proposition by taking a closer look at a question that often comes up when we are considering our relationships with people of other religious traditions. The question we often, for whatever reason, feel compelled to ask and answer is the question, who is saved? I am sure almost all of you have seriously considered this question at some stage of your training and ministry, and that you all know the standard range of answers that are offered. The answers range from the no one is saved answer of the naturalist to the everyone is saved answer of the universalists. Scattered between these two end of the spectrum answers are an array of answers ranging from Calvin's predestinarianism to Wesley's super soft Arminianism to Barth's hope-so universalism. And in addition to knowing the range of other theologians' answers to the question, I imagine that each of you has developed a proclivity towards one or another of them, perhaps adding, subtracting, or modifying the rubrics that characterize the answer in order to make it your own. I myself have a preferred answer that I will tell you about in a minute. Before I do that, however, I'd like to suggest that the usual answers to the question, who is saved, are made by theologians using a traditional theological method. Call it the theological point of view. They are looking back at what the biblical writers wrote about the subject and trying to systematize those comments into what they hope is a consistent and coherent position. I dare say that most of our answers to this question adopt a similar method. We read the biblical texts and, taking them both singly and as a whole, develop an answer based upon them. In addition, we usually take into account the church tradition in which we locate ourselves and factor in the official Orthodox position as well. Yet the theological point of view invariably provides answers that are incomplete and that need to be augmented by answers that are developed using a different method, a different point of view. That additional point of view I'm going to call the biblical writer's point of view, because it is similar to the way the biblical writers observed God's world, interacted with other people, told their stories, and made their cases in the collection of 66 biblical writings that we hold to be sacred. The biblical writer's point of view consists of experiences we have of God's world and the people in that world. When the biblical writers wrote, they were rarely interpreting and systematizing texts already written. They were responding mostly to their experiences of the world and how they saw God working in that world. They told stories of people they met in Palestine in the times before Christ, of places they'd been and events that had happened to them. In that sense, they were providing the primary material out of which the canonized scriptures emerged. The theologians, then, are interpreters of that primary material. Their writings are secondary. My suggestion is that when it comes to our relationships with people of other religious traditions, our point of view should primarily be primary. We should not be trying to fit the results of those friendships into a theological structure. We should consider them fresh data out of which the ongoing narrative of the kingdom of God continues to be told. How does this biblical writer's point of view work? Well, writers who adopt this point of view report on their experiences. They tell us what happened when they built the Tower of Babel, what King Herod said when approached by the wise men who were searching for the baby Jesus, how the crowds at Athens responded to Paul's recitation of his extraordinary experiences of God. They're not trying to develop theories of Babel building or political strategies of first century kings or psychological dynamics of Damascus Road experiences. They're telling stories, most often stories of how God was working in their lives. In so doing, they are providing us with a great deal of first-hand data, God working in the world data. that we can use first to understand what God is doing in establishing his kingdom on earth, and then to intuit how our gifts and our stories and our experiences fit together with all these other gifts, stories, and experiences of God at work. I'm wondering tonight if this isn't the point of view most useful to us in processing our own experiences of interreligious relationships, particularly friendships. What if instead of predetermining the inadequacy of relational experiences, at least as truth claims, we accepted each and every one of them as a piece of data, incomplete and partial by itself, but as an indispensable incident in the life of the kingdom of God on earth, like one small piece of a 1,000-piece Christmas puzzle, like the ones my family put together on holiday weekends. Each piece seems inconsequential, but without it, the whole picture remains incomplete. If analysis must be done, and we seem to be hardwired to do analysis, let it be done using a sort of calculus designed to measure a moving, changing thesis, or a Bayesian statistical method, whereby conclusions are cataloged constantly, changing with every new piece of evidence. Only those types of analysis can hope to do justice to what amounts to an ongoing narrative, the story of what God has done, is doing, and will do as a result of his revelations through Jesus Christ, his Son. I'm not for a minute suggesting that we replace our theologies with a collection of ad hoc experiences. We need theologies to look backward and sum up what we've learned about God thus far. We need Augustine and Aquinas and Luther, Calvin and Wesley and Barth, and whoever the theologians are in the 2020s and the 2030s who take their places. But I'm suggesting that accounts for what's happening right now and what they suggest will happen in our futures. For those tasks, personal, everyday experiences are essential. Who is saved is a valuable question when asked internally within the Christian community. It's an order-keeping question, helping us identify who we are and what we want and how we intend getting there. Who is saved is a terrible question when asked in the general population at large, a population made up of Christian and non-Christian religions and a-religions and anti-religions. In that setting, it is an in-your-face challenge meant to demean, and a question that has almost always zero chance of missiological success, let alone as a witness to loving our neighbors as ourselves. If out of some kind of dogmatic inertia, we feel we must ask it in this global setting, we must at least have a friendlier answer. The question is meant to be definitive, yet we are called to mere faithfulness. The question comes across as triumphalistic, yet we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. Asking who is saved is ineffective missiologically. We're called to be bringing in the sheaves, not judging the wheat and the tares. I'm going to skip a section here where I suggest that who is saved has not always been a question. That early on in the axial age, when the world religions as we know them were developed, it was more, soteriology was more a topic of discussion, and then in New Testament times it was more a promise of God, and it only became a question really during and after the Enlightenment, when scientific method came to dominate our. But I'm going to skip that. It sounds pretty boring, actually. And I'm going to jump to what I call a friendlier answer. I said earlier that I had developed my preferred answer to the question, who is saved, over the years, and that I would tell you what it is. Well, here it is. I called my answer Soteriological Agnosticism, meaning that I did not think we humans know the answer to a question only God knows the answer to. For a long time, I was convinced it was a friendlier answer to the question, who is saved? friendlier than no one is saved because it allowed that some of us might make it. And really, it was friendlier than the everyone is saved answer because it maintained some standards about who we get to sit next to in heaven. I built my biblical justification for calling it soteriological agnosticism around the biblical verses that indicate eternal judgment is God's alone. At least that's how I interpreted Matthew 7 and Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 5. I believed and believe that soteriological judgments are God's alone. I still believe that. But over time I came to question whether that phrase soteriological agnosticism really captured my position. My hesitations began when I read a bit about the history of the term agnosticism. In the Western world, Thomas Huxley actually coined the word agnostic in 1869, and after it developed from an ick into an ism, philosopher William Rowe defined agnosticism as the view that human reason is incapable of providing sufficient rational ground to justify either the belief that God exists or the belief that God does not exist. Strike one against the term. Only fools really think that human reason is sufficient to understand the ways of God. And then I read a list of people who claim to be agnostics: Charles Darwin, Thomas Huxley, Robert Ingersoll, William Stuart Ross, Bertrand Russell, Leslie Weatherhead. And frankly, I didn't like the company I was keeping. Strike two. And since the term was brand new, historically speaking, philosophically defined rather than religiously defined, and associated with some very shady characters, I realized I had struck out strike three. I decided I needed a new way to describe my position. And after some heavy linguistic lifting, I decided upon the term soteriological limitism. I really did this. I toyed with soteriological fallibility and soteriological frailty and soteriological liability, but in the end, I decided on limitism as being most adequate. And then, all of a sudden, I realized how silly this all was. I was spinning my theological wheels. I wasn't making any progress. Actually, I wasn't really answering the question. I was ducking it. And it dawned on me that I didn't need a friendlier answer. I needed a friendlier question. Deciding to change questions isn't as radical as it might seem. We do it all the time. We do it because some questions turn out to be the wrong questions, or because they are too confrontive, or they are unanswerable, or they're out of date. In his helpful book, The Achievement Habit, Bernard Ross says that whenever we find ourselves stuck on a problem, coming up with answer after answer, none of which seem to really fit, it is often because we're trying to solve the wrong problem. And one way to discover the right problem is to try different questions. In trying to answer the question, who is saved, the number of answers, nuanced answers, seems to grow daily, and none of them seem to really fit. As I said, my latest answer was really just a ducking of the question. Perhaps we're trying to solve the wrong problem. One of the problems the question, who is saved, is designated to answer is this: we don't know who is saved and would like to know. Is that really the problem we want to solve? Is that our problem? Is that the problem we should be trying to solve? Is that the problem God wants us to be working on? Perhaps not. In trying to determine the real problem, let me suggest we need to consider three things. First, what is it about our relationships with people of other religions that has made this a primary issue? That has led, for example, to the American Society of Missiology to dedicate its 2018 annual meeting program to its consideration. I suggest that the biggest change is the frequency of contacts we have with people who have religious commitments different from our own. Most of us no longer grow up in homogeneous religious hothouses. Instead, we meet Buddhists, Confucians, Hindus, Muslims, Mormons, New Agers on a daily basis. This is the biggest change in the past half-century, the change that has made interreligious relationships a primary theological issue. Second, once we acknowledge that the quantity of interreligious contacts has jumped exponentially, the question immediately rises about the quality of those relationships. Are those contacts in the main conflictual or friendly? Are people of other religions friends or foes? Should those relationships be conflictual or friendly? Should people of other religions be friends or foes? This is an important question that needs further research. My hypothesis is that whenever and wherever possible, these should be friendly relationships with friends, not foes. And with that as a stipulation, let me suggest the third element of this issue. That is a friendship with a person of a non-Christian religion different from a friendship with a fellow Christian? And given, of course, individual differences, are they essentially the same? This is also an important question that needs addressing. My hypothesis is that they are essentially the same. A friendship is a friendship. In researching each of these last 2 points, I would consider one element of the equation essential, and that is that whatever we do in relationship to people of other religions, it must be done within the commitments we have to our own Christian faith. Although we could talk long and hard about what those commitments are in terms of content and attitude, I don't believe the general principle would create much disagreement. Given the above, I believe that the new question, the one that should replace the who is saved question, should be this. How do interreligious friendships, how does this particular interreligious friendship contribute to God's kingdom? To such a question, every interreligious friendship is a contributing answer, a piece of the puzzle depicting the mosaic of Christian life and living. Francis said I should stop there. I have 3 more paragraphs that I discovered after I finished the paper, and she said if you're going to use those paragraphs, they have to be seeded into the paper before your ending, which just occurred. Well, we'll see. Recently, I was rereading William James' Varieties of Religious Experience for another project, and at the same time Charles Taylor's Varieties Revisited, which was a series of lectures he gave on the 100th anniversary of the publication of William James' Varieties. And the thing that emerged from this reading was his take on what we can still learn from James' century-old classic. Taylor believes that one of our enduring takeaways comes from one of James' central points, and that is that we can learn a great deal from an individual's religious experience, that his or her experience is valid knowledge to us. This, Taylor avers about James' position, is an extraordinarily useful antidote to the scientism that runs wild in secular culture today. Scientists using the scientific method, Taylor notes, and I'm quoting here, assume there is only one road to truth. We put the hypotheses that appeal to us under severe tests, and only those that survive are worthy of adoption. To put it dramatically, he goes on, we can win the right to believe a hypothesis only by first treating it with maximum suspicion and hostility. James, Taylor notes, takes a diametrically opposed position. For him, there are some domains in which truths will be hidden from us unless we go at least halfway towards them ourselves in faith. I believe that one of those domains that James would apply this insight to if he wrote about it, he didn't write very much about it, is interreligious relationships. Although he doesn't deal with the multi-faith question that directly, at one point he does suggest that we consider this sample question: do you like me or not? His comments, quote, "If I am determined to test this question by adopting a stance of maximum distance and suspicion and hostility, the chances are that I will forfeit the chance of a positive answer." He goes on, "An analogous phenomenon on the scale of the whole society is social trust. Doubt it, root and branch, and you will destroy it." So this evening, I would like to apply James' insights to our interactions with people of other religious traditions, holding those relationships, however deep or shallow, to the hard-nosed scientific test implied by the question, who is saved, will create, in Taylor's terms, maximum distance and suspicion. It is almost impossible that any kind of a positive, God-honoring relationship can come from such an approach. And my suggestion is that in such relationships, we go at least halfway in accepting what this child of God has to say about his or her relationship to whatever transcendent person or principle they have learned to embrace. To paraphrase James, a relationship cannot come at all unless a preliminary of faith exists in its coming. Thank you very much.
I think it is safe to say that the people here today want to establish friendships with those of other religions and cultures. And friendship should be fun, right? It should be easy. Well, in this address, I want to point out some obstacles to such an effortless road to those friendships. As Christians, we desire to love others, giving and receiving gifts from those different from ourselves. Gift of mission requires an understanding of cultural norms and habits different from our own. It further requires a respect for those alien ways. How can I understand and respect customs that run counter to my own deeply felt habits and values? The task of gifted mission requires that and more. At this point, maybe I should mention grace. The gospel demands invite failure, and we do fail, and often. One difficult task is gracefully receiving gifts from others that may not suit us. Another task is learning to give gifts that suit others rather than ones that we would choose for ourselves. We start out with optimism. We meet a Muslim on the bus. We attend an interreligious dinner. We visit a synagogue or a Sikh temple. But then, things happen that we didn't predict. Things that run contrary to our expectations. We experience tensions, roadblocks, misunderstandings. Interpersonal relationships falter. Where do we go from there? Let me outline a number of trouble spots for developing relationships with persons of other religions and cultures. We will talk about dress. What is expected of us if, for instance, we enter a mosque? How should we dress on the street or in the classroom if we live in a society in which religion affects dress codes? Are there sexual implications for dressing a certain way? How about hats? Where and when to wear them? A related topic is male-female interactions. What does it mean for a woman to look directly into the eyes of a man? That changes considerably across cultures. What is considered modest dress when we are in mixed company? When can a woman be alone in a room with a man? And does it matter which room? Those issues are related to role expectations. In some cultures, a traditional interaction hierarchy between men and women may be expected in family and neighborhood affairs, or even in academic papers. The academic setting may, excuse me, the academic setting may require something different. How can one be sensitive to such distinctions when visiting a Hindu family or teaching at a Christian university in an Islamic culture? Situations differ. Are there guidelines about role expectations that can guide us? How does one navigate expectations around religious practices? Can I pray with a Muslim friend? And how do I do that? What about dinner at a Hindu home? Do I skip my silent Christian prayer? Would that offend? Customs around time differ widely across cultures. If invited to a Muslim home for a meal, am I expected to come on time or early? Or is it more polite to be late? And how late? Then there are customs around eating. When Muslims are fasting during the month of Ramadan, can I drink water during a daytime visit? What about serving pork or shellfish to a practicing Jew? I'd better know the taboos beforehand. Some research is required. If living in a society where another religion predominates, living arrangements may be an aid or a barrier to friendships across religions. Can a woman live alone in a Muslim neighborhood? What about living with a Muslim family? Should a servant be hired? Is it okay to go out alone after dark as a woman? How does one handle pets? Customs may differ widely on such matters. Ideas also form a nexus of societal customs. What worldview predominates in the religious context you are entering? Is life an illusion? Does suffering predominate? Is equality a value? How about hierarchy? Should people seek liberty? Are grown-up children expected to leave home before marriage? Is life after death sought after or avoided? Understanding the ideas that inform life can help tremendously as one attempts to understand and befriend and share with people from another religion. Moral values and how they are expressed differ considerably across religions and societies. Where does truth-telling fall on the hierarchy of values you come into contact with as you befriend someone from another culture? What about embarrassment or losing face? Is it more important to excuse oneself for a social gaffe or just let it slide? Should you modulate your moral code when befriending someone from another culture? What are the limits of your own moral compass? When finding oneself in an awkward position around moral norms or failures, how to proceed can become a knotty problem. Each of the above topics greatly influence our interactions with persons, families, and groups from a different religion. Just learning that those topics are crucial is a big step. Navigating them turns out to be a lifelong process. Welcome to the world of gifted mission. To illustrate each of the above problems, let me tell a few stories. Ideas. Arvind Sharma, a Hindu scholar from McGill University, developed with some colleagues what he called a universal declaration of human rights for the world's religions. They started with the UN Declaration and added human rights that they believe are crucial to religious people. I was impressed. I asked Professor Sharma how I could help with that project. He said each religion should write a universal declaration of their own. So I gathered Christian scholars and put together a book on Christian views of human rights. Arvind wrote the introduction and a response to each chapter. By then, we were on a first-name basis. A friendship grew up around ideas, very different ideas about religion, fertile ground for a lasting relationship. In India, I stayed for 2 weeks at New College, north of Delhi, where I taught some short classes. The dean gave me a list of courses to teach. One was teaching music to college students. Music? Me? In India? I didn't know where to start. The ideas that shape Indian music were so very different. Even the scale was strange to me. I wasn't sure what kind of music the dean expected me to teach, but I certainly didn't think I could teach music to those students. To navigate this crisis, I used the Socratic method in my classes, something I often use with my husband, by the way. I taught with questions. What are your favorite instruments? How would you approach composing a song? What do you sing in church? Would you like to change church music? If so, how? Here the ground felt more solid. I recall one day after church while living in Indonesia, I complimented the pastor on the Indonesian hymn we sang. Most of the hymns sung were Western hymns sung in English. Clearly affronted, he replied, all the hymns we sing are Indonesian. I had missed the idea that everything appropriated by the Indonesian church became theirs. Oops. Dress. When I visited India, I wore the traditional shalwar kameez, a slim top covering wide pants. I had a few from a previous trip and thought they would be appropriate for the classroom. And really, they were. But one day, walking across the quad, a young woman student remarked, "So, do you think you can become an Indian in just 2 weeks?" I hope it wasn't too offensive to reply as I did, "No, of course not." But the tension was there, and there wasn't much I could do about it. If there had been time to form a friendship with that student, perhaps the tension would have melted away. As it was, I felt misunderstood, as I'm sure she did. Then there was the occasion during my 1 year teaching in Jakarta, Indonesia. I lived in a Muslim neighborhood down a small walking lane. One Saturday, I had no classes, so I was wearing blue jeans. As I strolled down the lane, I encountered an elderly woman. "Oh, you want to become young again, eh?" In that society, women dressed according to their age. Teenagers wore jeans, working women wore dresses, and older women wore long sarongs and traditional lace blouses. Again, I was out of step. I probably could have gotten away with wearing a dress, but jeans were just too much for the traditional Ibu. Let's move on to female-male interactions, a rich area for discussion. Closely related to dress, the way women and men interact can be a minefield in settings where another religion predominates. It surprises me that many Americans think it appropriate to look directly into someone's eyes to communicate a friendly attitude. In Indonesia, that is definitely taboo. I learned from my dean at Satyawacana Christian University in Java to look intently at a man's left shoulder. Is there a man in the crowd? Shoulder. Now, why is that? Because in Javanese society, it is a come-on for a woman to look directly into a man's eyes. That look sends a very strong sexual message to the man, something my dean obviously didn't want me to convey. When I moved to Jakarta, a staff member of the seminary, a male staff member, took me to the apartment they had rented for me. I made the mistake of walking into the bedroom behind him as he was showing me around. He immediately wondered out loud if he might come and visit me sometime. Another oops, that was a big one. My presence with him in the bedroom conveyed a strong message to him, one quite unintended by me. Sometimes we just have to learn from our gaffes, as Anita was telling us. After all, there is no written handbook for such social customs. And if there was, it would have to be different for every different society. The dress code was easier. In the Muslim Society of Indonesia, I just simply covered up my body in long, loose clothing that showed nothing of my body shape. The jeans in Jakarta was an exception because in the big city, some of those cultural norms are relaxed. But male-female interactions are sometimes tricky. Movie star images of loose American women predominate, and expectations of a Western woman's behavior may not always match our values. Communication. Indirect communication plays a major role in Indonesian society. To directly contradict someone is considered rude and ugly. So, indirect ways of communication are used and must be translated by the foreigner. In asking for directions, if you're driving a car, you're asking for directions from a passerby, they will never say they don't know where a place is. But they will stare at their feet for a few seconds. Then they will tell you in a soft-spoken way how to get to the place you are looking for. Don't fall for it. They have already told you quite clearly that they don't know. So if you follow their directions, you only have yourself to blame. You have to learn to read the culture. Never contradicting you or saying no can lead to relationship problems. An Australian professor I knew felt certain that, he said, you can never trust what a Javanese is thinking. They don't place any value on telling the truth. He was speaking of other professors at the university. After living in Indonesia for 5 years, he still didn't get it. He only stayed for 5 years. A Javanese will definitely tell you what he or she thinks. You just have to learn how to appreciate the way they tell you. Imposing our notion of truth-telling as frank communication doesn't really help. Sometimes, though, after friendships have formed and trust builds, a direct communication can warm our hearts. When we hiked the Annapurna Trail in Nepal, Rishi, our Hindu guide, got to know us very well. When we visited Hindu temples, he would sometimes ask to stay a little longer and do prayers. We were happy with that. One day, after prayers, he said, "It's hard for me to understand why you Christians limit yourself to one God when there are so many that could help you. We have specific gods to help us in each situation." Bingo, an open communication, the kind that we Americans prize. There are other ways to encourage direct communication. A striking interaction occurred during the doctoral exam of one of my students a story I tell in my book, Christian Women in Indonesia. As the director of his project, it fell to me to instruct the student how to revise his work. But as the only woman on an all-male faculty, it was inappropriate for me to take the lead in the meeting. Difficult. Knowing the cultural expectations, I waited until the meeting was officially closed. But before anyone could get up and leave, I said my piece. Everyone was relieved. The other professors wanted me to give the revision requirements. I was the chair of the committee. They just didn't know how to navigate that. I invented a special form of communication after the meeting to get the job done. In that case, the role expectations of the academic world conflicted with the role expectations of gender relationships. The university participates in both worlds. New ways of interacting need to be invented that both honor traditional mores and fulfill academic expectations. The essence of gifted mission is the giving and receiving of gifts. The how-tos of giving and receiving can be quite intricate and demand much sensitivity on the part of both sides. Two religions and two cultures face off. Can they find a middle way? Can they learn to receive and give gifts from one another? Time provides another example, and I won't take up much more. Rubber time operates in most situations in Indonesian culture. Coming on time to a dinner, for instance, is very rude. One should come late, at least 15 minutes, even better half an hour. That can be learned. What is more difficult are situations in which the academic standard of time and the traditional Indonesian standard of time conflict. Academic time goes strictly by the clock. Being on time to meetings means just that, being on time. Social time is more flexible. That kind of time works for afternoon tea or dinner or going shopping. One arrives politely late, just late enough in the ideal world. So now you're invited to a dinner at someone's home, a social event. Okay, you know what to do. But it's for an academic group. And a lecture, say, given by one of the faculty. So the professor invites the faculty to his home for dinner and a lecture presentation. How to go about going at the proper time? Do I go late? How late? Should I be on time, as I would be for a faculty event on campus? Not so easy. In such situations, misunderstandings easily arise. The professor presenting a paper may feel slighted if people come late. The host and the hostess may feel slighted if guests arrive too early, that is, on time. Trial and error mixed with a good bit of tolerance for difference is the recipe for this situation. Give a little. Be ready to be wrong. Receive advice from others. Let go of your Western idea of being on time, especially if you're a Presbyterian. But listen to others. Perhaps the Indonesians are wanting an on-time group to show respect for the academic side of the gathering. So get some advice. Gifted mission. These and many other challenges face us as we engage in cross-cultural and cross-religious friendships. Don't be in a hurry. Take time. Put prayer to work. Talk with others inside and outside of the situation. Be ready to receive. Be ready to give gifts. Be quick to forgive. Be slow to take offense. Give and take. And you will find joy as you build friendships with people of other faiths.